Uh, okay, I know some of you already, and I'm not sure if I know the rest of you. My name's Kevin Dowd, and I'm new at UH. I just started in September, and before that I was doing my PhD at Kingston University, and I was teaching there as well for a while. So I'm currently finishing my PhD, and it's not quite done yet. I'm about to submit in the next couple of months, so it's a busy time. But today I wanted to talk to you a bit about my research. I was scheduled, or I had written in the abstract that I would talk a bit about existing practice-based methods in graphic design, but I'm just going to keep it to my research for today because I'm conscious of the time restrictions. So, exploring practice-based methods in graphic design research. First things first, my personal interest in research has to do with political design, political graphic design. And since my undergrad, I've kind of focused on that. So my undergraduate thesis was on Obama's campaign, and my postgraduate thesis from my master's was on British political advertising, and then my PhD is on, well, actually, it's on political design as well. But I'll get into that a bit more. The focus, as I said, of my research is practice-based methods, and what that really means is bringing practice right to the core of the research project. So not just producing an outcome after using other methods from established fields like visual culture studies. So what was really interesting for me was attempting to kind of develop these methods that exist more exclusively for the graphic design practitioner, which I am, and which a lot of you might be too. So the reason I have some examples of posters on the board is because my research interest, like I said, is political design, and these are examples of Conservative Party posters. The one on the left is a very well-known Labour Isn't Working. You might have heard of this before. And on the right from 2010. And that frames the context of my research between 1979 and 2010. So in 1979, the Conservative Party hired Saatchi & Saatchi to do their advertising campaign. And they utilised this format for the first time, really, in their strategy. And since then, there's been this whole huge selection of posters produced for the Conservatives at every election, and they've all conformed to this kind of billboard format, which you'll see on the roadside, but also you'll see snaps of online. And this has kind of become like a contemporary space for political messages, and that was something I was really interested when I started my research. But I'm going to take a quick step backwards and talk more about my methodology, which is what kind of what underpinned my research. So my approach to the political poster, my approach to a selection of visual material throughout my research. So to explain that, I've done some simple diagrams. This is how I would look at, say, a poster or a piece of visual communication. So, and I would think, okay, it's broken down into different parts. And for the sake of this, it's broken down into type, image, hierarchy, and white space. We can have selections of images when we're looking at design, when we're looking at visual communication. So here I've got a selection of 4 images, and each of their components have different patterns. And my methodology looks at breaking up each of these original artifacts and reconfiguring them depending on what they are. So type would go with type, image would go with image, white space, hierarchy, etc. And in doing so, highlighting insights about how the visual communication is used within that context. So to explain further, I'm going to give you a simple example. This is a poster for the Avengers from 2012, which is a great film. How you would isolate a part of that image really simply using simple graphic techniques is to say trace the human outlines in the poster, to block them out, and then to remove the poster. So then you're left with a simple visual representation of what it is you want. So for example here, the human form, how it appears. But in order for it to have any significance, we need to kind of contextualize it a bit more. So before I do that, I just want to show this is how I've broken the poster down into different components. So I've blocked out the type, I've blocked out the image, the human figure, and this on the second to the right is how I've visualized hierarchy using simple graphic tools. So in order to kind of give that context, I need to think about, so what other posters exist. That's a bit broad. So what other action adventure posters exist from 2012 to start to create a kind of a pool to draw on. So I sourced the 6 most popular action adventure films from 2012, and I mapped their type. And I did the same for romantic comedy titles. Now, this is what I've done with them as an example today to show you how you can, I've combined them throughout my research. I've kind of done this in a more advanced way later. But having done this to each of the posters, you can then layer them, which is a very simple exercise. And there's, I think Matthias mentioned visual research earlier by Ian Noble and Besley. And they've looked at simple methods like layering and comparison as well. But I've done the same for, as an example, action adventure and romantic comedy titles, and you can see immediately that type is used in different spaces at different scales depending on the theme, and that's how this kind of comparison ran throughout my research. So back to the political poster. Why am I looking specifically at the Conservative Party poster? Well, first of all, they've got a really great archive for their material, which is based in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And they have housed a lot of their material up until the late 80s, early 90s. But even then, their archive wasn't full. So if you're interested in research, what you'll have to really think about is your sources at some point. And a really important thing to consider is your archive. Has your archive been used before? And some people have done research on Conservative posters, but actually there isn't a thorough archive for all of their material between 1979 and 2010. So part of that challenge was also gathering the material myself with the head archivist, Jeremy McElwain. But why the Conservative poster? First of all, it's a contentious space. People really respond to it and engage with it, and you see kind of a lot of these kinds of posters where members of the public have kind of painted over it or subverted it in some way, or changed the message, sometimes in humorous ways or sometimes in aggressive ways. It's also a space that all parties kind of recognise as a place for mudslinging or kind of visual debate where they can kind of slag each other off. And that's what's happening here with Labour's example. And another example, don't let him take Britain back to the 1980s. But this is really recognised by both parties as being this space for mudslinging, because even though they've produced these posters to this format, which is the printed format, they're only produced online and digitally, didn't maybe run in situ. So that's kind of another recognition of why they're important. Also, you get this back and forth between the parties. So you have one poster and they make a poster coming back at them but changing it and subverting it, and it goes back and forward. And you'll see in the upcoming election as well that this kind of activity will probably fill billboard spaces around London and online. But the online aspect of it's also really important. So in the last election, there was mydavidcameron.com. Did anyone see this? No? So it's essentially a website. It had huge success, had hundreds of thousands of hits, and people uploaded kind of edited versions, digitally edited versions of existing posters. So again, we can see the more sophisticated version of the earlier poster here. Another reason it's interesting is because of the amount of money that the Conservatives spend on outdoor advertising, which is this format. They spent nearly 5.2 million in the last election, compared to nearly nothing by the other parties. Most parties invest most of their money in direct mail, which all of them did. 2.4 million, 1.7, 2.3. All of the major parties really find direct mail as their most effective medium, but the Conservatives have always invested in outdoor advertising, and in particular the billboard poster. So they spent so much on it that they ended up being in the top 20 highest spending advertisers in 2010, up there with 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers, Kellogg's, BT. These people fill these spaces all year long, but the Conservatives were only there for a short period in early 2010. So that just shows you how much money they were putting into it in comparison to other organisations. So back to the political poster. When engaging with I took that approach of breaking apart in individual posters. So there's hundreds of posters between 1979 and 2010 that were collected and analysed. And to just show that process, I've done another simple diagram. So breaking it apart into its type, image figure, which means the human figure, and white space, hierarchy, and colour. So these were the starting points for my visual analysis. And this poster it's for personal research use. I needed to map where each of these components were going. So the green boxes on the left are the original poster, and each box after is type, image, white space, everything else, and some other information that would be relevant. And then they kind of look like this. I was using these throughout my research to quickly reference the design files. So each image, each poster had all of these attached design files for type, image, the human figure, white space, and hierarchy. And in order to kind of organize them, I just needed to place them somewhere. So that's how I use these kind of posters. And to show another example really quickly, taking this poster and mapping the type and figuring out what percentage of space is occupied by the type. This was also supplemented by information about the typefaces used, the most popular typefaces used, depending on the time or the theme. So taking all of these, I then did this same layering and played with transparencies as well to try and get that visual representation of type as a whole. And I did the same for different elections, for different themes, looking at things like health, crime, immigration. When these themes pop up, how does the type and image vary? How does the party leader appear? In relation to what themes does he most commonly appear? When does his size change? So I'll talk actually about that in a couple of minutes. So then I had these abstract kind of visual designs that didn't really have any context. So I then designed a series of posters, which aren't great to see at this size. But what I've done is I've written down the statistics of different type sizes and how they varied and how much space they've occupied at different elections and averaged them out. So I could start to get an impression. And in 1979, they used a lot of the space, with type filled most of the space. And in 2010, it was the type had kind of gotten smaller. And the reason that happened is because large bold type became associated with just negative political advertising and negative political design. And in 2010, there was a lot of positive as well as negative posters. You might remember them. We've seen some examples already. But I've never voted Tory before, but, and then a line under it. So those posters were all quite positive, and the type for that was very small, was set in regular. It wasn't bold and uppercase, which has become the kind of visual language of negative politics. So these posters were produced to kind of house these abstract designs and kind of explain them a little bit. And they have also been produced as part of a book in my research. So I've looked at type, I've looked at image, white space, hierarchy, and some of them yield more interesting or relevant findings than others. One example of this is how the human form is used in the Conservative poster, and how women appear more commonly in a similar way to how the Conservative leader will appear, and men appear more commonly in a way that the opposition leader might appear. So I've kind of shown this with simple shapes to kind of highlight the spaces more commonly occupied. And the motivations for the Conservative Party using this, I don't know if it's conscious that they've done it, but it's definitely something that can be observed. And as I mentioned before, the opposition leader and the Conservative leaders appear at different sizes and in relation to different themes. And obviously when a message is positive, the Conservative leader will appear a lot more often and at larger sizes, in some cases filling the entire space from some of the posters from the 90s. And then if they're negative, the Conservative leader will appear much smaller. As you can see on the bottom one, these are of Cameron appearing much smaller. But generally speaking, the Conservative leader doesn't really appear in negative messages, as you can imagine, because it would have bad connotations. And if the opposition leader is featured, he will generally be much bigger as well, because they'll be attacking him. So I mentioned before that some avenues of my research have been more successful than others, and I've just given you a snapshot of some of the things I've been looking at. But for example, looking at how hierarchies are used on all of the different posters throughout the last 30 years, you can see that you can start to mass these kind of interesting abstract images. How much do they tell us about visual communication, particularly for the Conservative Party? Well, it's debatable, because I can figure out, the more common hierarchies, but it's not really telling us anything. But it's part of the research process to find things that do work and find things that aren't as successful. And even though I really liked some of the visuals that came out of this, it wasn't necessarily as easy to identify kind of reasonings for. I also use design these are images taken from the books I've been designing as part of my research and the exhibition I'm playing with Kingston. So they're kind of squished down to fit onto the screen from the exhibition stuff. But I used graphic design to kind of explain things like how different gender, men, women and children appear in relation to themes. So orange is women, blue is men, and the faint yellow is children. And you can see that women appear more often in relation to tax and spending, and men more often in relation to economy, and obviously education. Children appear more often in relation to education. But yeah, so I use design in this way to kind of map some of my other findings that weren't necessarily born of that practice element of the methodology. I also used it to map themes. So these are the most common themes at different elections. It's a bit small on the screen: 1979, 83, 87, 92, 97, 2001, 2005 and 2010. And then each theme links up. So taxes and economy and jobs, they're the themes that have come up most commonly in the Conservative posters. And then spending, health, crime, and then the least common one is debt, which has only come up once or twice. So I've also used design to create just simple diagrams and charts to explain, for example, how often the opposition leader has featured in posters, and you can see that he has appeared at times, but in the last 10 years or 15 years, a lot more. So it's important in my research to bring the kind of visual elements of it back to the source, I guess, in one sense. And I've thought a lot about how the kind of focus of my research is this space, the 48-sheet poster, the billboard space. So that's why I've designed to scale different posters. This is it from an angle, but it's quite long actually. A lot of these posters to try and work in larger formats and with both within indoor spaces and outdoor. But actually, as with any methodology, with any research methodology, you have to think about replicability, or how you can kind of use these tools in a different context. And that led me to my second project, which was with Sense. And Sense is an organization that advocates for the rights of deaf-blind people. And deaf-blind people are people who have both sight loss and hearing loss. So you get different kinds of people in that community. Some people are fully blind and have partial hearing. Some people are completely deaf and have partial sight. So they're a really interesting kind of group to work with. And when I went in to see them, I had developed this process or this system looking at Conservative posters, but they weren't a political organization in the same sense. They were a different kind of political organization, and they had a different kind of body of visual material. And that comprised mainly of their members' magazines, which were really interesting to look at. So taking this system that I developed, I did the same thing I'd done before. I looked at the images and the magazines, and particularly the magazine covers, as being representative, because they had a lot of magazines between 1983 and 2012 that I was looking at. So I decided to focus on their covers, and I applied my system to a selection of magazines. So this is one of the earliest ones, and I did a similar thing where I broke it apart into its different components and started to look at it. For the purposes of this investigation, I had realized that the most interesting insights came from looking at type and image. So I focused on type and image for this project, and I mapped out for 1984 I've given some examples in 97, 2012. For every year, I mapped out the type and looked at how much space it was occupying. And I layered them by year to see how different years looked, to get a kind of visual representation for it. So every year had type, image, and then image figure. So again, the human figure, looking at how the human figure was depicted on their magazines. So I saw straight away that between 1984 and 2012, the amount of type on their covers decreased dramatically. So this is 3 or 4 covers layered from that year and that year. So you can start to see, okay, they've really cut down the amount of text on their covers. But I wanted to look more closely at the way the human form was represented on their covers, because I think that was really interesting to me. And on the left, this is a spread from that book I was mentioning. On the left, this is all of the human figures from 1984 on the cover, and on the right from 2012. And the scale of the human figures on their covers has completely increased, both in line with technological advancements where they can now use photographs in different ways, but also because these people are of central importance to the community. So working with them was so insightful and really, really interesting, because they really care as an organization, obviously, about the community they work with, and they keep promoting them on these magazines, showing them engaging with normal activities and just having kind of a good time, and going to these events and participating in the community. And they show that by putting these people on their covers and constantly reaffirming these ideas. So that led me to the conclusion that that's what's important for the magazine, the depiction of all these different members of the community, engaging, having fun, doing positive things. And that led me to think about a deaf-blind person engaging with the magazine itself. So the most common type of vision loss that affects deaf-blind people is called Usher syndrome, and it kind of involves macular degeneration, and you end up getting tunnel vision in your eyes, and your sight kind of deteriorates more generally. So I tried to imagine how a deaf-blind person might engage with the members' magazines, but obviously this was just my imagination. I was using a vignette and blurring in, taking it out of focus, and trying to see how it might look to them, and that made me wonder how accessible this would be for their the deaf-blind members of their community, which is everyone. So the first thing I looked at was the low contrast figures and shapes are lost. That's the first thing I noticed, and then also this hierarchy. The colors are just so bright, and if you have visual impairment, you don't have the usual kind of references you have if you're fully sighted. So the hierarchies are different. So I wondered if this might make it more difficult for visually impaired people to see the magazines. And while I was working in Sense in their archive, collecting their visual material, I got to know some deafblind people, and I got to see how they work. And a lot of them use these kind of high contrast screens you've probably seen before, and you can probably activate on your computers using the kind of yellow and blue and black. And I started to think a bit more about these colors and how they help visually impaired people see more clearly. And that led me to think a little bit further on patterns, colors, contrast, before coming up with an approach that I thought might help visually impaired readers see the imagery more clearly. I've already established that people are what's important to this magazine, that people feature on the covers, people feature throughout the magazine. It's all about showing the people engaging in the community. And I wondered if this design was good for visually impaired users. I didn't think it was, so I applied this kind of simple technique. I desaturated the bright colors and I used high contrast lines to pick out the forms and the movements to kind of show what was going on more clearly in the image. And applying that previous, kind of approach, I wanted to see how it might look to someone who's visually impaired. And I did a series of these as explorative kind of tests. But obviously this is all kind of self-contained. I'm doing this myself as a researcher, but it doesn't really make sense unless I engage with the deafblind community itself. So I designed a visual questionnaire which was tailored to its audience using the typeface recommended by Sense. and using quite a large typeface and using this scale. So that scale 1 to 5, 1 is not at all and 5 is very clearly. And the question is, how well can you see what is happening in the picture on the left? Please make a mark on the line above to show your answer. So some people didn't have great sight, so making a mark instead of asking them to circle specifically was the best way to do it. 1 is not at all and 5 is very clear. So I had a bunch of participants fill this out, and I was lucky enough to have Sense invite me to their annual Sense conference in Birmingham. So I went up with a bunch of questionnaires, and I asked participants to fill it out. And this is what it looks like on the inside. So again, I'm trying to think of who's filling this out. They have visual impairment. I wanted them to see the selection more clearly, so I used the standard black and yellow, try and pick it out a bit more. And this was all kind of run by Anna McGee, who's the head of research at Sense, before I produced it. So there was a process of showing her examples and then getting her to agree to things. And then I had a selection of lovely participants fill it out and let me know how they could see the different images, how well they could see them. And the scale that they were using, that I've been using throughout that, was based on ranges of visual acuity loss, which was sourced from a visual impairment journal. And this was an example that was one of the strongest examples. On average, it increased the visibility by 1. So 1 to 5 is 1 is not at all, 5 is very clearly. Someone said 3, it increased their visibility by 4. And I found that the saturation of colors was very important. If it was fully saturated, it would be difficult to see. If the image was desaturated and the branding was desaturated, but the high contrast lines remained, bright, then it would be the most visible. Whereas if the image was completely black and white, it wouldn't be as visible. So there's this kind of point somewhere where I had to identify, based on the results, which were the most successful visual treatments. And the most unsuccessful was this, which was completely black and white, and I tried a selection of different color combinations, because every individual's vision is different and some people find certain colors easier to see. So I tried a whole selection, and this was the most unsuccessful, and most participants said it made this more difficult to see. So it was really interesting to see that difference. So that all kind of came together for a proposal for Sense, which I'm in the process of submitting to them as part of my research, but also after my research to maybe engage with them further. I think for me the most interesting outcome from this was that the more profoundly impaired someone's vision, the higher their responses were. So if one person marked 1, and after looking at these, some of them went up to 4. So it really helped them see more clearly, and that seems to go up the further down someone's vision goes. So that's become a proposal that I'm in the process of completing as part of the PhD, and I'm kind of now in discussion with Sense about developing that into a bigger research project in a few months after I've submitted my thesis. So those two examples were kind of intended to give you a snapshot, a really, really quick overview of my research. But it was important for me to think about these methods, these graphic design methods that have practice at their core, but that I've applied to two very different formats. One is a very large-scale outdoor format, and the other is a private members magazine. So they had very different kind of criteria. But for me, it was important to figure out how these methods could be applied in different contexts and what kind of outcomes they could lead to. So yeah, I think that pretty much sums up my talk. So does anyone have any questions? No? No? Okay, cool. Thank you.